Okay, good morning, everybody. Hope you can hear me. Is this working? Yeah, that's fine. We're running a little bit late, but that's not a big deal. I'm a very quick speaker. I can speak very quickly. What we can find, though, as well, is that this is being recorded. So if I do speak too quickly, you can at least go back and figure out what the heck it was he said, hopefully. I'm going to talk about needs analysis for English medium instruction. I'm going to tell you about 3 things that I think are important, and then bring them together and offer you something that I think you can use if you're going to work with EMI. My name is John Airey. I'd like to thank Professor Amy Choi for inviting me here. I'm from Stockholm. I didn't look actually what temperature it is today in Stockholm, but it's about 0, maybe minus. I don't know, maybe somebody can look it up. And this is our major lecture theater, and you can see the snow. And today I'm going to talk about students changing to English, teachers changing to English, disciplinary differences, those 3 things, and then bring all that together to try to offer you an idea about what I think you could do. So let's get into this. Students changing to English. If students are changing to English, they're meeting new ideas, they're meeting new vocabulary and new language, but they also need to know the discipline in Chinese. So this thing that they're learning it, right? So they don't know it. Otherwise, they wouldn't need to be there. So potentially they need to know this in Chinese, right? So I'll tell you a little bit about an empirical study that I did. I found situations, I work in physics, I found situations where students were reading 2 courses in parallel, one in English and one in Swedish. And then I went and filmed those lectures, and then I did 1-hour interviews with the student. And I asked the students to explain the same concepts in both languages. And I didn't do this directly after one another. I did this with a little bit of separation. We talked about other things, and then I'd say, oh, maybe you can tell me about this in Swedish, or maybe you can tell me about this in English. So what I ended up with was being taught in one language and then explaining in both languages what they'd been taught. What I found was that students spoke 45% slower in English, but it's a little bit unfair, right? I mean, they've never met these ideas before, and directly after the lecture, I'm asking them about them and getting them to explain these things in English. But the quality of the descriptions in both languages was similar. So what this means is that, well, what this doesn't mean is that you learn just as well in English. It just means that whatever you've learned, you can explain just as well or just as badly in English or in your home language. In other words, the ideas are one thing, and the language that you use to produce, to explain them, is another. So we don't get at learning here, we get at production. So I had 22 students, and some of the students did have serious problems describing disciplinary concepts in English. And all 3 were first-year students, and they'd never been taught in English before. So this is interesting because it's about the switch, right? And the 3 that had trouble were the 3 that were just switching. And so this models the system that we're looking at. I'll give you an example. This is some Swedish here, so it'll be interesting for you. I didn't understand why it wasn't a real, vad ska jag säga, tal. Only when you hade upphöjt till 2. But she said it was ett sånt där tal. What did he say? Well, actually, what the person was trying to say was this. I didn't understand why it wasn't a real number, only when it was squared. But she said it was an imaginary number. So this is I squared, for those of you who are interested, who know this. And it was the first time this person had met imaginary numbers and didn't understand what I squared was. So what's needed? Well, 2 things. students need to make their knowledge their own. So this person's learning this, but they obviously haven't learned. So that we could see that that was a learning issue, not a language issue, right? And then students need to be able to explain the discipline in both languages. So a possible approach might be that students work in groups to solve a problem, and they use Chinese, but then they figure out together how to explain the issue in English, and then they present in English and get feedback. But it takes more time, right? So this is the thing. It takes more time. If there's one thing you want to take away from this lecture, it takes more time. So that was students changing to English, and I'd like to move to teachers. And we're getting a pattern here of it takes more time, right? The difference is here. The teachers know the discipline, right? The teachers know how to teach. We hope, at least. Usually, we know the disciplinary language too, because we've got this English. But you might not feel confident in teaching in English for the first time and changing, right? Question you have is, do I need to do anything differently? What do I need to do? So I've got an empirical study that looked at that, and I had 18 Swedish lecturers who were learning, just going to switch to teaching in English, and they were on a course with me. And sneakily, I said to them, oh, I'd like you to come to the first lesson with a 10-minute short presentation of something that you would usually teach. So they came and they did what they would usually do, but just for 10 minutes. And then I said to them, I'd like you to come back next week and do exactly the same thing, but in English. What happened? So we're modeling the switch, right? Well, I transcribed all of this, of course. And when you look at the transcription, actually, there's a shift in speech rate. So before you start to look at what they did, it's slower, right? So when they taught in English, they took more time. What does this mean then? Well, actually, we had 3 types of lecturers. They were coming back to do the same lecture again, but in English. What did they do? Well, there were people who were very structured the first time round, and they made no change to their lecture when they came back. There were other people who were very structured the first time round, and when they came back, they did something different. And there were people who've got a free structure. And what do I mean by that? I mean people who are, in some senses, perhaps very student-centered, because they didn't really have to structure. They bounced their ideas off students. And so these people, what happened turns out to be quite different. So the first one's actually quite straightforward. There were 2 options. If you did the same thing in English, your lecture was either longer, so they went on for like 15 minutes. Some of them went on for 20, because I didn't want to stop them, because that was my idea, right? And some of them, the end of the lecture was just cut right off. So they said, because we're teachers and we know with 10 minutes, I finished 10 minutes, and we won't have time for the rest, is what we would say. So what that would mean if you were doing that in an EMI situation is, you're going to need more time if you want to do exactly the same thing. Then there were these people who worked differently. Some of them chose to miss out some of the content. So they didn't cover all of the things that they covered the last time around. Some of them covered everything that they did, but with less redundancy. And this is a little bit sneaky thing, right? They managed to get through everything that they got through last time. It's just that they didn't maybe explain it twice, or give another example or something like that, or say it in 2 ways. They just got through it, right? And some of them covered all the content, but they didn't really get down into the same depth for any of it. And so they skirted along the surface in order to actually do this. And of course, we don't know what the pedagogical effects of those things are. But the most interesting people are these people who are free structure, who would normally come along and they would bounce off the students, perhaps. If you want to be really unkind, you could say that they haven't planned. But actually, I don't think that was the case. It's just that they know, I know my subject. You bring it on, we'll talk about it. And what happened here was they presented different information, but they probably present different information every time, right? We're supposed to be talking for 10 minutes and they finished after 5. Why was that? We know that they're speaking more slowly, and I was scratching my head until I went and looked. And what it was, is because they just didn't have the language to do what they normally do in their first language. So in the first language, I'm very quick to actually jump onto what you said and build on it and talk around that. One way that one of the people who did this, the first time around, he came and he just talked, drew on the board and just explained from his head. When he came back, he had very structured PowerPoint. And that person, of course, then did it to the right time. So you can make some tentative conclusions about students changing to, so about teachers changing to English. Lecturers probably need more time to do the same job, just like the students needed more time to production, right? Some lecturers might be able to rationalize and work more effectively, but we don't know what the pedagogical effects of that are. Lecturers who tend to be less structured and more student-centered, perhaps, are the ones that might have more problems changing to English. So the ones who are very used to actually bouncing off their students and engaging them might be the ones who have difficulty actually changing. And it may be pragmatic for those types of people to change their style when they change to EMI. Okay, so that was teachers changing to English. I want to talk quickly about disciplinary differences and then bring it all together. So knowledge is created quite differently in the natural sciences and in the humanities. In science, we want to build one coherent model of the world, so knowledge has to be agreed between everybody. But in the humanities, the whole point of the humanities is to have a different view of the same thing. And so the knowledge is disputed and contested, and this leads to different approaches to language. And we can say in the sciences, the knowledge is the same whichever language you use, but in humanities, language is how we create knowledge. And so this is differences about what we think about using EMI. So in the natural sciences, you can expect people to have the least objection to using English. But in the humanities, this is how we produce our knowledge, and therefore it feels like an imposition on the knowledge itself. Here, maybe all of it's in mathematics anyway, or most of it. And so it doesn't feel like it's that important. And we can make a prediction about that. And actually, when we looked at Stockholm University, what we found was this. In how much of your teaching is in English? 35% in the humanities said almost all my teaching is in English. But 76% said almost all of my teaching is in English in the sciences. So there's a big difference there. So we conclude that teaching in English will mean different things for different disciplines. And so a one-size-fits-all approach is not going to work. So when, a little bit political here, when the government says that you need to do something, that means different things for different disciplines. Oh, I want to bring this all together now, and I believe I have 2 minutes left. So let's see. I did start a little bit late, so I could steal some perhaps, but I'd rather not. Talk a little bit about disciplinary literacy and suggest, in my work I've suggested that we build disciplinary literacy, not just for the academy, but for 3 different places. We build for the academy, but also we need to be a physicist, a chemist, whatever we are, a historian in society. And we also have a workplace that we're doing this for. And so we have different types of disciplinary literacy. And these 3, we can maybe put them together like this. And we say that each of these different sites or places put different demands on language. And I conceptualized it in this way as a sort of triangle. And we can think of this as a space. and we're placing our discipline somewhere within this space, what do we prioritize? If we're physicists, I'll tell you, we don't care about the rest. We're just doing physics. The rest will sort itself out. So if you are a physicist and you know your physics, then you'll figure out how to use that in the workplace eventually, because it's the physics that we're learning, that we're teaching. And you'll also figure out what it means to do in the sector. So we are very much, and a lot of disciplines are like this, that we just do it for the academy. Let's take nursing, for example. Actually, we're less bothered about these people being able to write research papers. We're more interested in them actually being able to do the job, right? And to be able to talk to patients. And so we shift the space that on what's important towards this side. Now, this is when my time is supposed to be up, but there's just a little bit left, so I promise it won't be too long. Take a historian. There aren't very many jobs for historians. You know, there isn't really much of a workplace. And so maybe we're interested in the academy and also about communicating history in an everyday sense to society. But if you're an engineer, all the engineers I know, they say, well, we use your physics, but we have a workplace. We're very much becoming engineers, and we deal with clients. And so we're going to place ourselves on all of these things are important. So what about a second language? Well, all of that was in the first language. Forgot about that. It's unlikely that you need to do the same things in your second language. You need to do different things. And so we need a different triangle. And so we can say that the emphasis that we put on using English in this case instead of Chinese should be different. We do different things in different languages. Also, I talked earlier on about other modes of representation being important in science. So diagrams, graphs, coding is important, becoming increasingly so. Gesture and hands-on work in the experimental lab and so on with apparatus. And so we can have something for that as well. What do we need to do with those things? So bringing all of this together with a suggestion. And it's called this disciplinary literacy discussion matrix. Once you've named something, you have to keep it right. Off the top here, if you look, we've got the places that we were talking about in the triangle, the academy, the workplace, and society. And then down the left-hand side, we've got the first language, so let's say it's Chinese. And reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And then we've got English and reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And then other types of things that you might have to use, like mathematics, graphs, diagrams. Graphs are interesting, actually, because often graphs end up in newspapers. And they never have, you know, oh, well, don't get me started about that. What I'm suggesting is an introductory question. So using that with faculty, an introductory question. What types of communication do your students need to master in which languages for these different places, right? So if we just go back, we're going to go through here and we're going to tick which boxes and talk about what they need to do for each box, right? Actually, it can be quite interesting to figure out what they don't need, because the easiest thing to say is, yeah, oh, we do everything. Well, we haven't got time for that. So what things do they not need in English? What things do they not need to do in this? And so on. And then we've got two follow-up questions. Once you've decided as a faculty what your students need, how are you going to do that? And how are you going to say? Finally, this is what the head of the physics department said when we used this particular thing. So something like this shows you huge gaps in what you do. You suddenly realize, never thought about that. So I'd like to finish there and hand over to our esteemed discussants. Thank you very much.